The radio crackled with static at 3:47 hours, breaking the pre-dawn silence that had settled over forward operating base resolute like a shroud. Staff Sergeant Kira, Ghost, Volkov pressed her headset closer, straining to catch the fragmented transmission bleeding through the interference. What she heard made her blood run cold. Reaper 6, under heavy, coordinates November 7 Alpha, multiple casualties, request immediate. The signal died, leaving only the hollow hiss of dead air. In the Tactical Operations Center, a dozen pairs of eyes turned toward the communications officer, whose face had drained of color. Reaper 6 was the call sign for Navy SEAL Team 7's ground element, 12 of America's most elite warriors who had inserted into the Kunar Province Mountains 18 hours earlier. Their mission: capture or kill Hamid Rashid, a high-value target whose network had been bleeding coalition forces dry for months. Now they were silent. Colonel Marcus Hayes, the FOB commander, stood motionless behind the central console, his weathered hands gripping the edge until his knuckles turned white. 28 years in the Army had taught him to read between the lines of broken transmissions. When SEALs called for help, the situation was beyond desperate. "Sir," the communications officer stammered, "we've lost all contact. Last known position puts them 15 clicks northeast, grid November 7 Alpha 4478. Hayes closed his eyes, processing the nightmare unfolding before him. The terrain around those coordinates was a death trap, narrow valleys carved by centuries of erosion, ridgelines that offered perfect enfilade fire for insurgents, and ravines that swallowed radio signals like black holes. It was why they'd chosen helicopter insertion in the first place. "Options," Hayes barked, his voice cutting through the tension. "Sir, closest QRF is 45 minutes out by Chinook," the operations officer replied, referring to the Quick Reaction Force. "But in that terrain, with potential anti-aircraft threats." Hayes didn't need the sentence finished. 45 minutes was 44 minutes too long when your people were dying. And flying heavy transport birds into a hot landing zone was tantamount to feeding million-dollar aircraft to insurgent RPGs. The silence stretched like a taut wire until a voice spoke from the shadows near the coffee station, a voice that most of the men in the room had learned to ignore over the past 6 months. "I can be wheels up in 10 minutes. Every head turned toward Chief Warrant Officer Kira Volkov, whose slight frame seemed almost fragile beneath her flight suit. At 28, she was young for her rank, younger still for the responsibility of piloting an A-64 Apache attack helicopter. What made the room's collective dismissal even more pointed was the simple fact that she was the only pilot currently available, and the only one most of them didn't trust with their lives. The mocking had started the day she'd arrived at Resolute, fresh from Fort Rucker with her shiny new wings and a reputation that preceded her like a curse. Ghost, they called her, not for her tactical prowess, but for how she seemed to disappear whenever the conversation turned to combat experience. The whispers followed her everywhere: desk pilot, simulator queen, daddy's girl who'd pulled strings to get her combat assignment. They didn't know about the night terrors that woke her in cold sweats, or the prescription bottles she kept hidden in her wall locker. They didn't know about the IED that had taken her Humvee in Iraq 3 years earlier, killing her gunner and leaving her with a Purple Heart she never wore and a medical discharge that had taken 2 years of appeals to overturn. They only saw what they wanted to see: a small woman in a big machine, playing at war. Colonel Hayes studied her face in the harsh fluorescent light, searching for something he couldn't name. Her gray eyes were steady, unflinching, the eyes of someone who had already made peace with whatever death might bring. "Volkov, you're talking about a single-ship mission into hostile territory with unknown threats." "Yes, sir," her voice never wavered. "The SEALs went dark. We don't know if they're compromised, captured, or—" He couldn't bring himself to say the word. "Sir, with respect, we know they're Americans, and they're in trouble." Kira stepped forward into the circle of light around the tactical display. My Apache carries 16 Hellfire missiles and 1,200 rounds of 30 mm. Whatever put Reaper 6 on the ground, I can kill it." The operations officer shook his head. "The weather's turning bad. Cloud ceiling is dropping. Visibility is going to shit. Even if you find them, you'd be flying blind." "I've flown in worse." It was a lie, but she sold it with conviction. The truth was that she'd never flown a combat mission in her life, not a real one anyway. But she'd spent 3 years studying every after-action report from the Afghan theater, memorizing terrain features and threat patterns until she could navigate the Hindu Kush in her sleep. She knew the land better than pilots with 50 combat missions. Hayes looked at the clock, 3:52 hours. With every passing minute, Reaper 6's chances grew slimmer. "What's your fuel state?" "Full tank, sir. 4 hours of flight time." Kira pulled up the mission planning software on the nearest terminal, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "If I depart now, I can be on station in 22 minutes. The room erupted in muttered conversations as Hayes weighed his options. Send a green pilot into a potential meat grinder, or wait for the QRF and risk losing 12 SEALs to enemy action. Neither choice was good, but one was clearly worse than the other. "Ghost," Hayes said finally, using her call sign for the first time since she'd arrived at Resolute. "You're cleared hot. Bring our boys home." The pre-flight inspection took 8 minutes, a personal record that would have made her instructors at Fort Rucker proud. Kira's hands moved with practiced efficiency across the Apache systems, checking hydraulics, weapons status, and avionics with the muscle memory of 1,000 training flights. The AH-64D Longbow Apache was a technological marvel. Twin General Electric turboshaft engines producing nearly 4,000 horsepower, a tandem cockpit that put her in the front seat with her weapons systems, and enough firepower to level a city block. But for all its sophistication, the Apache was still a machine that required human intuition to reach its full potential. And as Kira strapped herself into the pilot's seat, adjusting her helmet and connecting her communications systems, she felt the familiar calm that came with being exactly where she belonged. The engine spooled up with a rising whine that cut through the morning air like a blade. Ground crews scattered as the massive rotors began to turn, casting shifting shadows across the flight line. In the Tactical Operations Center, Hayes and his staff watched the thermal signature of Ghost 7 lift off into the pre-dawn darkness, carrying their hopes and fears into the unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan. What they didn't know, what Kira herself barely understood, was that she was about to become a legend. Not because of her flying skills or her tactical acumen, but because of what happened when ordinary people are pushed beyond their limits and choose to answer the call anyway. In 22 minutes, she would face a test that would define not just her career, but her understanding of what it meant to be a warrior. The Apache climbed into the darkness, its navigation lights blinking steadily as it disappeared beyond the mountain ridges. In the operations center, Hayes stood watching the radar track until it faded from the screen, leaving only the hope that Ghost 7 would return with better news than they'd sent her to find. The flight north took her through terrain that looked like the surface of an alien world. Jagged peaks thrust skyward like broken teeth, their snow-covered summits lost in low-hanging clouds that promised the kind of weather that killed pilots. Kira kept the Apache low, following the natural contours of the valleys and using the terrain to mask her approach from potential threats. Her night vision goggles painted the landscape in ghostly green hues, turning the world into something ethereal and strange. The Apache's forward-looking infrared system, or FLIR, painted a digital representation of the heat signatures below, small dots that could be insurgents, wildlife, or nothing more than rocks that had retained the day's warmth. Every shadow was a potential ambush, every ridge a potential firing position. "Ghost 7, this is Resolute Base, radio check over." The voice of the Tactical Operations Center crackled through her headset, seeking confirmation that she hadn't been swallowed by the mountains. Resolute Ghost 7 Lima Charlie, she replied, using military shorthand for loud and clear. 15 minutes out from target area, flying nap of the Earth, maintaining communications discipline. Copy Ghost 7. Be advised, weather is deteriorating rapidly in your area. Recommend you expedite your search pattern. Kiera glanced at her instruments, noting the dropping barometric pressure and increasing wind speed. The weather was going to be a factor, maybe the deciding factor. But 12 SEALs were counting on her, even if they didn't know it yet. She pressed deeper into the mountains, her Apache a dark shadow against the darker sky. Somewhere ahead, Reaper 6 was fighting for their lives. And for the first time in her military career, Chief Warrant Officer Kiera Ghost Volkov was flying toward the sound of guns instead of away from it. The radio silence was absolute as Kiera approached the last known coordinates of Reaper 6. In the eerie calm that precedes violence, she switched her communication system to the SEAL's tactical frequency, hopping to re-establish contact with the ground team. What she found instead was a chaos of electronic warfare that told its own story. Static filled her headset, not the natural interference of atmospheric conditions, but the deliberate jamming signature of sophisticated enemy equipment. Someone was actively suppressing communications in this valley, which meant the insurgents weren't the typical ragtag militia that coalition forces had grown accustomed to fighting. This was a coordinated operation, planned and executed with military precision. Kiera reduced power and began a careful orbit of the target area, using her Apache's advanced sensors to paint a picture of what lay below. The FLIR system revealed heat signatures scattered across the valley floor, some moving, others disturbingly still. Vehicle wrecks glowed white-hot against the cooler background, their twisted metal still radiating the heat of recent explosions. Through her night vision goggles, she could make out the debris pattern of what had once been two Black Hawk helicopters. The aircraft had been torn apart by heavy weapons fire, their rotors scattered across a 100-meter radius like the petals of some deadly flower. It was clear that Reaper 6's insertion had gone horribly wrong from the very beginning. "Jesus," she whispered into her microphone, forgetting for a moment that radio discipline meant keeping personal observations to herself. The scene below looked like a nightmare, a carefully orchestrated ambush that had caught the SEALs at their most vulnerable moment. But as her eyes adjusted to the carnage, she began to see signs of life. Muzzle flashes winked from a rocky outcropping near the center of the valley, followed seconds later by answering fire from positions further up the slope. The SEALs were alive, at least some of them, and they were fighting. The distinctive sound signature of American weapons, the rapid crack of M4 carbines, and the deeper boom of squad automatic weapons, cut through the electronic jamming like a beacon. Kiera felt her training take over, pushing down the emotional response to the devastation below and focusing on the tactical problem at hand. She needed to identify friend from foe, establish communication with the ground team, and figure out how to provide effective fire support without risking friendly casualties. It was the kind of complex engagement that senior pilots trained years to handle, and she was about to attempt it alone, in deteriorating weather, against an unknown number of enemy forces. The Apache's weapon systems came online with a series of electronic chirps and displays that painted her cockpit in red light. 16 AGM-114 Hellfire missiles hung from the aircraft's stub wings like sleeping dragons, each one capable of destroying a main battle tank at ranges exceeding 8 kilometers. The 30mm chain gun beneath her feet held 1,200 rounds of depleted uranium ammunition, enough firepower to level every structure in the valley below. But firepower without precision was just destruction, and destruction without discrimination was murder. Kiera needed eyes on the ground, someone who could talk her onto legitimate targets and keep her from accidentally engaging friendly forces. She needed communication with Reaper 6, and she needed it now. Switching to emergency frequencies, She began broadcasting in the clear, abandoning communication security in favor of reaching the trapped SEALs. Any Reaper 6 element, any Reaper 6 element, this is Ghost 7 with immediate close air support. If you can hear this transmission, key your radio 3 times. The response came not through her headset, but through her eyes. An infrared strobe began flashing from the rocky outcropping where she'd seen the American muzzle flashes. 3 quick pulses followed by a pause, then 3 more. Someone down there had an infrared beacon, and they were using it to signal their position. Reaper 6, Ghost 7, I see your IR strobe. Stand by for close air support. What's your situation? Over. The voice that came back through the static was strained with pain and exhaustion, but unmistakably professional. Ghost 7, Reaper 6 actual. We have 8 walking wounded and 2 urgent surgical. Enemy forces have us pinned from the north and east, approximately company strength with crew-served weapons. We need immediate fire support on marked targets. Kira felt her pulse quicken. 8 walking wounded meant 4 SEALs were either dead or too badly hurt to fight. An urgent surgical was military code for casualties who would die without immediate medical attention. Time was running out. Copy, Reaper 6. I'm going to orbit your position and identify targets. Keep your people down and mark anything you want me to hit with IR illumination. She paused, then added what every close air support pilot learned to say: danger close will be broken. It was a promise and a warning. She would bring her weapons as close to friendly forces as necessary to save their lives, even if it meant risking them in the process. It was the kind of decision that could end careers or create legends, and she was about to find out which. The first target revealed itself as she completed her orbit. A heavy machine gun position dug into the hillside about 300 meters north of the SEAL's position. The weapon's muzzle flashes were clearly visible through her night vision, and the tracers streaming toward the American position left no doubt about its hostile intent. Kira lined up her shot, using the Apache's target acquisition and designation system to lock onto the enemy position. The crosshairs steadied on her heads-up display as the aircraft's fire control computer calculated range, wind speed, and target motion. Her finger found the trigger for the 30mm chain gun, and she felt the familiar weight of impending violence settle across her shoulders like a mantle. Reaper 6, Ghost 7. I'm engaging the machine gun position to your north. Keep your heads down. The chain gun spoke with a voice like thunder, sending a stream of depleted uranium rounds downrange at nearly 1,000 rounds per minute. Each projectile was the size of a small bottle, traveling at over 800 meters per second with enough kinetic energy to punch through concrete walls. Where they struck the hillside, the earth exploded in fountains of dirt and shattered rock. The machine gun fell silent. Good hits, Ghost 7. The relief in the SEAL team leader's voice was palpable. Machine gun is destroyed. We have more targets for you, 2 RPG teams in the tree line to the east, and what looks like a mortar position about 500 meters up the valley. Kira was already repositioning, bringing her Apache around in a tight turn that would give her a clear shot at the eastern tree line. Through her thermal imaging system, she could see the heat signatures of men moving through the vegetation, carrying the distinctive shapes of rocket-propelled grenades. These weren't farmer fighters with rusty AK-47s. They were moving with the discipline of trained soldiers, using proper fire and movement techniques to advance on the pinned Americans. The first Hellfire missile left its rail with a whoosh of rocket exhaust and a trail of smoke that was visible even through her night vision goggles. The laser-guided weapon tracked straight and true toward the target she designated, its warhead armed and ready to deliver 18 pounds of high explosive to whatever it found at the other end of its flight path. The explosion lit up the valley like daylight for a brief moment, the thermal bloom washing out her night vision and forcing her to rely on instruments. When her vision cleared, a section of the tree line was simply gone, replaced by a smoking crater and the scattered debris of what had once been an RPG team. "Direct hit," came the call from below. "RPG team is neutralized. Continue attacking targets to the east." But even as she lined up her second shot, Kira noticed something that made her blood run cold. The enemy forces weren't breaking and running as most insurgent groups would when faced with close air support. Instead, they were repositioning with the kind of discipline that spoke of professional military training. And worse, they were moving toward positions that would give them clear shots at her aircraft. The war was about to become very personal. The second Hellfire found its target with the same precision as the first, turning another section of forest into a moonscape of shattered timber and scorched earth. But even as the explosion echoed through the valley, Kira's threat warning systems began to scream. "Missile lock! Missile lock!" the automated voice announced with mechanical calm, alerting her to the fact that someone on the ground was tracking her aircraft with a surface-to-air missile system. The distinctive radar signature painted on her defensive displays told her it was either a SA-7 or SA-14, shoulder-fired weapons that were deadly to helicopters, but could be defeated with proper defensive maneuvering. "Chaff, chaff, chaff," she called out, dispensing clouds of metallic strips designed to confuse enemy radar while simultaneously throwing her Apache into a violent evasive maneuver that pressed her back into her seat. The aircraft dropped like a stone, auto-rotating through 300 feet of altitude in seconds while she fought to keep control. The missile missed, but just barely. Through her peripheral vision, she caught the bright streak of its exhaust as it passed overhead, close enough that she could feel the heat of its motor through her canopy. Had she been a second slower with her defensive response, or the enemy gunner a bit more skilled, the war would have ended for her right there. "Ghost 7, you okay up there?" The concern in the SEAL team leader's voice was evident even through the static. "Still flying," she replied, though her hands were shaking slightly as she brought the Apache back under control. "Be advised, enemy has man-portable air defense systems. I'm going to have to adjust my attack profile." What she didn't say was that her fuel state was becoming a factor. The violent maneuvering had burned through more JP-8 than planned, and she was now looking at less than 2 hours of flight time remaining. If she couldn't break the enemy's hold on Reaper 6 soon, she would have to leave them and return to base for fuel, a prospect that would likely seal their fate. The mortar position revealed itself as she climbed back to attack altitude, its thermal signature blooming white-hot as the crew prepared to fire another salvo at the trapped SEALs. Mortars were particularly dangerous because they could strike targets behind cover, and the American position offered little protection from plunging fire. Kira didn't hesitate. The third Hellfire left its rail in a streak of flame and smoke, guided by the invisible laser beam that she kept trained on the target despite the buffeting wind and her aircraft's constant movement. The missile's flight time seemed to stretch into eternity as she watched it track toward the mortar position, knowing that men were about to die, but feeling no remorse for what was necessary. The explosion was different this time, larger, more violent, with a secondary blast that suggested she'd hit an ammunition cache. The mortar team simply ceased to exist, vaporized in an instant by the combined effects of her warhead and their own ordnance cooking off in a chain reaction that lit up the valley like the 4th of July. "Outstanding, Ghost 7. The SEAL team leader's voice carried a note of something approaching awe. "Mortar position is destroyed. That was a hell of a shot." But Kira wasn't listening to the praise. Her attention was focused on the tactical situation, which was evolving in ways she hadn't expected. The enemy forces weren't withdrawing as they should have after losing 3 major weapons positions. Instead, they were adapting, changing their tactics to account for the presence of her aircraft. And that meant she was facing professional soldiers, not insurgents. Someone with military training was coordinating the ground forces below, someone who understood how to fight against American air power. It was a realization that changed everything about the tactical problem she faced. The radio crackled with a new voice, different from the SEAL team leader but equally professional. Ghost 7, this is Reaper 6 Bravo. We've got movement in the wadi to our south. Looks like they're trying to flank us. Can you put some hate on grid November 7 Alpha 4521? Kira checked her map display and found the coordinates. A wadi was a dry riverbed that would provide concealed movement for infantry, exactly the kind of terrain feature that smart soldiers would use to avoid her weapons. She swung the Apache around to the south, scanning the landscape with her thermal imaging system. There, heat signatures moving in single file through the depression, at least a dozen men with weapons and equipment. They were maintaining proper spacing and using cover like professionals, but they couldn't hide from her sensors. The Apache's FLIR system painted them in stark white against the cooler background, making them perfect targets for her chain gun. Reaper 6 Bravo, Ghost 7. I have eyes on 12 to 15 military-age males moving through the wadi, engaging with 30 Mike. The chain gun roared again, its depleted uranium rounds chewing through the earth and everything in their path. The enemy soldiers scattered like leaves in a hurricane, some seeking cover behind rocks, others simply falling where they stood. It was brutal and efficient, the kind of mechanized killing that modern warfare had perfected. When the gun fell silent, the wadi was still. No movement, no return fire, no heat signatures that suggested survivors. It was what military professionals called a good kill. Enemy forces neutralized with minimal expenditure of ammunition and no friendly casualties. But even as she savored the tactical success, Kira knew that the fight was far from over. Her ammunition was running low, her fuel was becoming a factor, and somewhere in the darkness below, there were still enemy forces who wanted to kill her and the Americans she was protecting. The war was just getting started. The next phase of the battle began without warning. As Kira completed her attack on the wadi, her defensive system screamed another missile alert. But this time, it wasn't from a shoulder-fired weapon. The radar signature was different, larger, more sophisticated. Someone had just lit her up with what her training told her was a Zu-23 anti-aircraft gun, a twin-barreled, radar-guided system that could put out over 3,000 rounds per minute of 23mm ammunition. Radar lock, radar lock. Her aircraft's defensive systems announced with the same mechanical calm, but Kira knew this was different. You could outmaneuver a shoulder-fired missile with quick thinking and aggressive flying. A Zu-23 was another matter entirely. It fired a stream of radar-guided projectiles that could track and engage multiple targets simultaneously. She broke hard left, diving toward the valley floor while dispensing chaff and flare in a desperate attempt to break the enemy's lock. The Apache's engine screamed as she pushed them beyond their design limits, trading altitude for airspeed in a race against time and physics. The first burst of 23mm fire lit up the darkness like a deadly fireworks display, tracers streaking past her canopy close enough that she could see individual rounds tumbling through the air. The second burst was closer, impacting the rocky outcropping where she'd been seconds before, and sending showers of sparks and stone fragments into the night. Ghost 7, break right, break right. The voice from below was the SEAL team leader, and the urgency in his tone told her everything she needed to know. He could see something she couldn't, and whatever it was about to kill her. She yanked the cyclic hard over, feeling the Apache respond with the kind of violent maneuvering that pushed her anti-G suit to its limits. Blood drained from her head as the aircraft pulled through a 6G turn that would have been impossible for most helicopters, but the Apache was built for exactly this kind of abuse. The third burst from the Zu-23 passed through the space she'd occupied a heartbeat earlier, close enough that she could smell the cordite in her cockpit. Had she been a fraction of a second slower, or the enemy gunner slightly more accurate, there would have been nothing left of Ghost 7 but burning wreckage scattered across the valley floor. Reaper 6, Ghost 7, she gasped into her microphone, fighting to keep her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "I need that gun position marked. I can't engage what I can't see." "Working it," came the reply. "Stand by for IR illumination." Through her night vision goggles, Kira watched as someone on the ground, probably the team's joint terminal attack controller, aimed an infrared laser at a position high on the northern ridge. The invisible beam painted a target that her aircraft's sensors could lock onto, revealing the location of the anti-aircraft gun that had nearly ended her war. But engaging a ZU-23 was a delicate proposition. The weapon system was typically surrounded by infantry and secondary weapons, making it a hard target that required precision engagement. And with her current ammunition status, she would get exactly one chance to eliminate it before her ordnance was exhausted. The fourth Hellfire missile armed itself with a series of electronic chirps that sounded almost musical in the chaos of combat. Kira steadied her aircraft despite the continuing threats, painting the target with her own laser designator, while the missile's guidance system locked onto the reflected energy. At a range of nearly 6 kilometers, it would be a challenging shot even under ideal conditions. The conditions were anything but ideal. Wind was buffeting her aircraft, her fuel was running low, and somewhere in the darkness below, enemy soldiers were trying to kill her with everything they had. But the SEALs were counting on her, and failure wasn't an option. "Fox 3, she called, using the traditional announcement for a laser-guided missile launch. The Hellfire left its rail with its characteristic whoosh, trailing smoke and fire as it arced through the darkness toward its target. 18 seconds later, the ridge erupted in a fireball that was visible for miles. The ZU-23 and its crew simply ceased to exist, vaporized by 18 pounds of high explosive that had been delivered with surgical precision. Secondary explosions suggested that she'd also hit an ammunition depot, adding insult to injury for the enemy forces below. "Outstanding!" The shout from the ground team was loud enough to be heard even without radio amplification. "ZU-23 is destroyed. That was a hell of a shot, Ghost." For the first time since arriving in the valley, Kira allowed herself a moment to breathe. The immediate air defense threat was neutralized, which meant she could focus on providing close air support without constantly looking over her shoulder for incoming missiles. But her celebration was short-lived as she checked her weapons status. 3 Hellfire missiles remaining, 400 rounds of 30mm ammunition, and an unknown number of enemy forces still threatening the lives of 8 wounded SEALs who were depending on her to keep them alive until help arrived. The math was simple, and it wasn't in her favor. The tactical situation was about to get much worse. As Kira orbited the battlefield, taking stock of her remaining ordnance and fuel, her thermal imaging system began picking up new heat signatures along the ridge lines surrounding the valley. They appeared in ones and twos at first, then in larger groups, until it became clear that enemy reinforcements were arriving in significant numbers. "Reaper 6, Ghost 7, she called to the ground team. "I'm seeing new heat signatures all around your position. Looks like they're bringing up reinforcements." The response from below was grim but professional. "Copy, Ghost. We're seeing the same thing. Estimate 40 to 50 additional personnel moving into blocking positions. We're about to be completely surrounded." Kira felt her stomach drop. 40 to 50 additional enemy forces meant that the SEALs were facing odds of at least 6 to 1, and that was assuming all 8 of their walking wounded were still capable of fighting effectively. With 2 urgent surgical cases requiring constant medical attention, the effective fighting force was probably closer to 6 men against nearly 70 enemies. The numbers didn't lie, and they weren't good. Her defensive systems chirped another warning, but this time it wasn't a missile lock. Someone was painting her aircraft with a laser rangefinder, probably calculating firing data for mortars or rockets. It was a reminder that even with the ZU-23 destroyed, the skies over the valley were far from safe. Ghost 7, Reaper 6 Actual. The team leader's voice was strained but determined. We need you to hit the reinforcements before they can get into position. Priority targets are the heavy weapons teams. We can handle the riflemen, but we can't take effective fire from RPGs and machine guns. Kira switched her sensors to wide area search mode, scanning the surrounding terrain for the distinctive heat signatures of crew-served weapons. The enemy was being smart about their deployment, using the natural cover of rocks and vegetation to mask their positions. But thermal imaging didn't lie, and she began to identify priority targets. There, a heavy machine gun team setting up in a position that would give them enfilade fire along the SEAL's defensive line. Another team with what looked like a recoilless rifle, positioning themselves for a direct fire shot at the Americans' rocky fortress. And scattered throughout the hills, dozens of individual fighters armed with rifles and RPGs, all converging on the trapped Americans like wolves closing in for the kill. The fifth Hellfire missile locked onto the machine gun position with mechanical precision. At this range, barely 2 kilometers, the flight time would be minimal, giving the enemy no time to react or reposition. It was the kind of shot that her instructors at Fort Rucker would have called a gimme, assuming she could hold her aircraft steady despite the wind and continuing ground threats. Reaper 6 Danger Close Fire Mission, Hellfire's going hot. The missile streaked through the darkness like a falling star, its exhaust trail visible to everyone on the battlefield. The explosion that followed was both beautiful and terrible, a perfectly spherical fireball that expanded and collapsed in less than 3 seconds, erasing the machine gun team from existence and leaving nothing but a smoking crater in the hillside. But even as she celebrated the successful engagement, Kira knew that time was running out. 2 Hellfire missiles left, less than an hour of fuel remaining, and enemy forces continuing to pour into the valley like water flowing downhill toward an inevitable conclusion. The 6th Hellfire took out the recoilless rifle team with the same clinical efficiency, but it was becoming clear that her remaining ordnance wasn't going to be enough to break the enemy's stranglehold on the valley. There were simply too many targets and not enough missiles to engage them all. Ghost 7, Reaper 6. The team leader's voice carried a note of something that might have been resignation. We're taking effective fire from multiple directions. Our ammunition is running low and we've got more wounded. How much longer can you stay on station? Kira checked her fuel gauge and felt her heart sink. 30 minutes max. Then I have to return to base or risk flameout. The silence that followed was eloquent in its despair. 30 minutes wasn't enough time for a quick reaction force to reach them, and everyone on the frequency knew it. The SEALs were going to have to hold their position with dwindling ammunition against overwhelming odds, hoping that luck would carry them through until help arrived. But Kira wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. There had to be something she could do, some tactical option that would tip the balance in favor of the Americans. She'd spent years studying close air support doctrine, memorizing every technique and procedure that had been developed through decades of combat experience. And then she remembered something from her training that might just work, if she was willing to risk everything on a single, desperate gamble that would either save the SEALs or get them all killed in the process. It was time to find out what she was really made of. The idea that came to her was so audacious, so far outside normal doctrine, that her instructors would have failed her for even suggesting it. But desperate times called for desperate measures, and Chief Warrant Officer Kira, Ghost, Volkov was about to attempt something that no pilot in her right mind would ever consider. She was going to land her Apache in the middle of the battlefield. The concept violated every principle of rotary-wing aircraft employment that had been developed since the helicopter was invented. Attack helicopters were meant to engage from standoff ranges, using their speed and firepower to strike targets while remaining beyond the reach of enemy weapons. Landing in a hot zone turned a multi-million-dollar weapons system into a very expensive bunker, and bunkers, by definition, couldn't fly away when things went bad. But as Kira studied the tactical situation, she realized that conventional tactics weren't going to save the SEALs. They needed something that the enemy wouldn't expect, something that would disrupt their carefully coordinated attack and buy time for the quick reaction force to arrive. Her Apache carried more than just missiles and bullets. It carried psychological impact, and sometimes that was more valuable than firepower. Reaper 6, Ghost 7, she called to the ground team. I'm going to try something unconventional. I need you to mark your perimeter with IR strobes and keep your people low. This is going to get interesting. The response from below was immediate and concerned. Ghost 7, say again your intentions. Reaper 6, I'm coming down to your level. Literally. Kira began her descent into the valley, trading the safety of altitude for the ability to engage targets at close range with devastating effect. I'm going to set up shop in your backyard and provide fire support from ground level. Ghost, that's insane. You'll be a sitting duck for every RPG and rifle in the valley. Kira couldn't argue with the assessment. It was insane, tactically unsound.